Good morning, everyone. Oh, my mic works this year, which is fabulous. Thank you for joining us. It's wonderful to have you here. This is the opening panel of the 36th Annual Conference on U.S.-Turkey Relations. We're delighted to have you, and as you can see, we've got a wonderful panel. We've got Dr. Joshua Walker from APCO Worldwide, and we've got Mr. Jonathan Cohen from the U.S. State Department. So hopefully we'll have a great discussion today. We're going to focus on the political landscape in the United States, in Turkey, and across the region. We'll discuss prospects for strengthening the bilateral alliance and mutual interests that our two nations share across the international community. Our goal here is really to set the stage for the rest of the conference by providing you with a broad and qualitative perspective on the U.S.-Turkish strategic relationship. This is going to include a little bit on NATO, but that'll be coming up in the next panel, counterterrorism policy and shared democratic values. This is the only panel on the conference that's not really focused primarily or exclusively on trade and economic issues, though we'll touch on them. But we're going to try and take advantage of this to really keep our discussion as broad and open as possible, and hopefully have a little bit of fun if you'll allow us. We've got about 45 minutes. At the end, I'll ask some questions. I'll ask each of our panelists to give us a little overview of themselves. At the end, if we've got time, we'll open it up for a Q&A. So if you'll join me in giving Dr. Walker and Mr. Cohen a round of applause, we will. If you wouldn't mind each taking a moment to tell us a little bit about what you're working on and your backgrounds, that would be wonderful.
Please start.
Okay.
Protocol.
Thank you, Gillian, and thank you to the ATC. It's a privilege to be here as a participant this year. I've been honored to be here a few times in the past. And a little bit about my background. I've been in the U.S. Foreign Service for 30 years, and I've been either covering or following closely developments in Turkey and in the U.S.-Turkey relationship for about 20 of those. I served at our embassy in Ankara from 2000 to 2004, and I've been in my current job as the Deputy Assistant Secretary who covers Turkish affairs as well as Greece, Cyprus, and the liaison between Europe and the Middle East since last August. So I knew I was coming into this job in the springtime and watched with great concern as the coup attempt unfolded in Turkey, and knew that my task was going to be significantly harder because of the changing dynamics in Turkey and the way that the United States would need to support our Turkish allies and to adjust to the new realities that were on the ground. And that indeed has been the case. It has been, I think as everyone in this room knows, a challenging year. And we have well-known difficult issues, but we also have far more areas of commonality and strategic alignment. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about today is the other areas of the strategic relationship between the United States and Turkey, as befits two allies. We have common interests in Turkey's region on every side. And I wanted to share a brief anecdote, and then I'll turn it over to Joshua. When I was starting in this job, and I was meeting with former U.S. ambassadors to Turkey and asking them to tell me their perspective on the U.S.-Turkey relationship, why it mattered, and where they thought it should go. And one of them said to me, just before he went out as ambassador, he had sat down with a very senior U.S. general and said, "General, tell me about this relationship." And the general said, "Do you want the long version or the short version?" He said, "Well, I know you're a busy man. Give me the short version." So the general pulled out a map, and he pointed at Turkey, and he said, "Look where it is." Then he closed the map and said, "We're done." Joshua.
With an introduction like that, how can you top that? That's great. I'm Joshua Walker. It's always great to be back here. I feel like it's becoming like deja vu. Every time we come, we say, well, things can't get any worse. Last year was right after the coup. The year before that, we had Taksim, all these Gezi Park. Every time, I'm an eternal optimist, and I constantly get in trouble in this town for being an optimist. I refuse to be anything but an optimist. I don't know why I study Turkey sometimes, but I'm in love with the country and the people. But I'm not naive. And so I think, really this time, I hope this is the worst that it gets. And I think that some of the issues that the leaders have already talked about are very challenging. And given that this panel talks about political issues, it's hard not to mention some of the challenges that we have. And thankfully, I'm no longer in the State Department, so I'm not going to have to worry about some of the diplomatic protocol I would have had to in the past. So hopefully we can have some fun with that. But I think for this audience, you know, we're among friends. And I think it's hard to be a friend of Turkey in this town right now. And I thank the American-Turkish Council for every year putting this together. There's real value in history. There's real value in tradition. And I think this relationship, the U.S. Turkey relationship, the American-Turkish Council, it's too important to simply give up when things get difficult. And I would argue that while it may seem very challenging for the next 6 months in this town, not just because of the U.S. Turkey relationship, but because of all aspects of what's going on in this town. Sitting in this hotel, it's hard not to think about some of the other issues that we could discuss. But when you think 5 years, 10 years, it's very clear that there's only one direction for us to go, and that's up. So I remain doggedly optimistic, even though cautiously optimistic, and you know, hope that some of the areas that we have disagreements as friends, we can still agree to disagree on some areas, and in some areas where there are issues that we really need to move past, that we can kind of focus on the business to business, the people to people, because at the end of the day, because of great civil servants like Jonathan, people like General Jones and others who've kept this relationship so strong, it's for the next generation to not mess up the good work that has been going on. And I'm less worried about the government to government, even when things are challenging like they've been this week, because ultimately the mechanisms are there. But what we need to be focusing on is what is that future and what's not there that we need so that when crises like that have emerged this week because of a series of unforeseen or unfortunate incidents can let us have a conversation where the perception gap doesn't continue to emerge, where what you hear in Turkey today seems to be completely disconnected from what's in Washington, and what you hear about Turkey and Washington seems completely disconnected. So how do we merge that gap together, both on the government side and on the private sector as well? So I'll stop there and get into the questions.
Very well said, thank you. I think cautious optimism is a fair way to go forward, at least for the purposes of this discussion. So thank you for that, Joshua. So being the political panel, I thought we would dive in with a question about public perception, something that I've heard a lot of folks talking about yesterday and this morning. So I thought it was a good topic for us to open with. So during these highly charged political times, here in the United States and in Turkey, obviously, I'm concerned it's becoming increasingly difficult to have a discussion about the bilateral relationship that's not viewed through a political lens. There's this sort of pervasive and I would say misguided assumption that if you support or champion good relations between the United States and Turkey, you're inherently politically motivated. It's assumed you're either pro or anti the administration here in the United States or pro or anti the administration overseas in Turkey. So my question for you is how can we avoid or seek to avoid that political pitfall? Is it even possible anymore?
Please go ahead.
We'll choose from,
okay.
We'll alternate between you going forward.
Well, it's hard to make a general statement about it, but I think last week we had examples in both directions of the pitfalls and the possibilities. And I want to go back to the statement that came out after the meeting between President Erdogan and President Trump, where the White House said that the meeting discussed how to further strengthen the deep and diverse relationship between our two countries. And the United States President reiterated the commitment of the U.S. to the security of our NATO ally Turkey and the need to work together to confront terrorism in all its forms. We don't get statements like that from the very highest level about any country very often. So when we do, it's an opportunity for us to amplify it and to take that message and at the governmental level work on it, but also in the public space when people who are talking to the press about the relationship between the countries, to remember that that's what our two leaders have said is the intent for our nations to pursue.
No, I'd just pick up where you left off. I mean, this is the most challenging thing. The trouble is when somebody who looks as young as I do has to remind people how we've been in different places over the last 15 years and that, you know, this is not the first time that we've had a level of anti-Americanism that's very troubling inside of Turkey, but also a level of kind of anti-Turkey, I would argue, in the American press and in the U.S. side. Both sides want to focus on the negatives and no one wants to focus on the positive because, as you know very well, spending time on the media, a train wreck is much more interesting to watch than isn't a smooth, no one talks about how many times the train goes fine and there's no trouble. It's when there's a derailment that people begin to focus on it. And so, yes, there are some real issues. And I think last week and even today as it continues to unfold, there are some strategic mistakes that are being made. And the perception is not necessarily reality, but in the political space, perception becomes reality. And the question is, it's not just simply saying, okay, well, you need to do a better job of PR. I mean, as someone who works at a PR and strategic communications company, I would argue there seems to be something genetically different about Turks, that PR is seen as a bad thing, and we shouldn't have to defend this, right? Anybody who's been to the Grand Bazaar and starts talking to salesmen, you know how great Turks are at selling things. They're the best salespeople in the entire world. But when it comes to their own country, there's a real difficulty. And I think one of the challenges is there are real divisions within. And even in the space we're in right now, the U.S.-Turkey relationship, there are so many different groups that claim to speak on behalf of the U.S.-Turkey relationship. There are so many different people that want to do this that it's easy to reduce it to the personalities of Tayyip Erdogan and Donald Trump. And so I agree with what Jonathan said. When you have a statement like this that comes out that highlights how important it is, rather than simply saying, well, that's just a diplomatic jargon, no one cares about that, and let's focus on the fun footage of somebody beating up somebody else, we need to say, okay, let's take a step back and look at the broader strategic relationship. It's hard. It's really hard work. And I think one of the challenges is we've seen the pitfalls of kind of missed expectations. And I think the miscommunication that often happens across the Atlantic can't be pinned on any one individual or any government agency or any private sector. But we all, in some ways, have to do this together, because in some ways it's not in anyone's interest to point fingers. Because when you point a finger at somebody, there are four fingers pointing back at you. And so it's easy for the Turks to say, you made these mistakes, and it's easy for the Americans to say, well, you made these mistakes. But if we're truly friends and allies, then whatever happens to either of us affects both of us. And so I think the question here is, under the last administration, there was a feeling that there was a reemergence of a model partnership and a U.S.-Turkey relationship that would be able to kind of fulfill the dreams and aspirations that it's always had, but at the same time, a misunderstanding on both sides of what that relationship fundamentally was about. And we are so focused on the short term in terms of tactical advantages that we're not thinking holistically. And I think that the sum total of our parts currently aren't as strong precisely because of that short term tactical mentality and not the larger long term strategic vision that we should be having. Because if we only focus on how people perceive us today and we start reacting to it, it only feeds into that bad media cycle.
I think that's right.
If I can add one other thing. There is a tendency among some media to get away from, let's call it fact-based reality. And there have been allegations in the media in Turkey about official U.S. involvement in things that we absolutely were not involved in, suggesting that we somehow knew about the coup in advance, or that we somehow supported it or didn't condemn it wholeheartedly. And we do condemn it wholeheartedly, and we did at the beginning. So people have agendas that they try and advance through sometimes misinformation, sometimes conspiracy theory. And I think we need to roundly step up and confront those.
I think that's right as well. And if, as friends, the United States and Turkey, if we're going to point the finger on specific things that go awry, I think it's also incumbent upon us to also point the finger at things when they do go well. Dr. Walker mentions that, nobody likes to talk about things when they're going routinely or they're going well. Nobody likes to talk about the fact that President Trump and President Erdogan have had several phone calls over the last few weeks to coordinate on the bilateral relationship, or that President Trump was the first foreign world leader to reach out to President Erdogan in the wake of the referendum to congratulate him on the successful results. So I think it's incumbent upon us here to talk about those things as friends of the bilateral relationship. So building on this question, I want to just talk a little bit about public perception on the part of civilians on both sides. It seems lately there's these kind of vast misperceptions among the American public about Turkey, about Turkish people, and among the Turkish public about the United States. And these misperceptions on both sides, they have created a climate in which public estimation of one another seems to be, unfortunately, at a low. Not necessarily an all-time low, but a low. So what can we do as friends of the bilateral relationship at this conference and going forward to try and combat these misperceptions? Do you have any thoughts or recommendations for all of us here in this room?
Well, there are a number of pieces that fit into this puzzle, and one of them that's absolutely critical is the business piece, which so many people in this room are here to advance. I think we need to shine a brighter light on the great business cooperation. There are something like 1,400 American firms that are working in Turkey now. They've created thousands and thousands of jobs in Turkey. We need to take a look at how much American investment returns to the U.S. We need to try and grow that business partnership because, as one of the previous speakers said, that is the cement in the links. But we also need to broaden the connective tissue so that when we're talking in public, we're not just talking about disagreements over the YPG and Fethullah Gulen. We're also talking about how we've worked together in Afghanistan for over a decade, how we are together trying to bring about a peaceful, stable Syria, how we have a common vision for many things, including making the region in which Turkey sits a peaceful and prosperous one, and how the benefits of that redound in both of our societies.
So it will be ironic to say this on a political panel, but to focus less on politics. The domestic politics are so heated in both capitals in both countries right now that what's happening in some ways with the U.S.-Turkey relationship is less directly resulting of kind of what two great nations are doing, but more a function of the political moment we live in. And so whether it's the referendum or whether it's the coup in Turkey, opponents or proponents use the relationship for their own particular means. And the problem is when you do that, you taint that relationship and it becomes polarized. In the same way in this country, when you start reducing Turkey to one individual leader or to one individual caricature of whatever that may be, then suddenly the greatness and kind of diversity that Turkey represents throughout its history, not just for the 95 years of the current republic, but the hundreds of years of the Ottoman Empire and the region that Jonathan's talking about, is reduced. And it's very easy to kind of polarize it. And unfortunately, both politics here and in Turkey, the extremes seem to be in the ascendancy right now, where unless you have an extreme point of view where you say something completely outlandish and you really go out of your way to say something offensive, you can't really get any media attention. And I think the trouble there is, because of the fact that we want to focus on the positive aspects, there might be some great stories out there. And when I think about the entrepreneurship, when I think about kind of the next generation in terms of demographic trends that I see in Turkey, when I think about where Europe is headed and where that Europe will look different without the inclusion of Turkey, we can't simply separate things and say, we're going to try to protect the U.S. bilateral relationship with Turkey over here, and whatever happens with Turkey and Europe is separate. It's not separate. It's all part of the same. And in this town, there's a constant feeling of kind of who lost Turkey and what direction is Turkey going in. And I think Jonathan's point earlier, the general made, it's not going anywhere. It's right here. It's been there from the beginning, and whether it's during Ottoman times or whether it's currently, Turkey is not just a European country or a Middle Eastern country, it's all of the above. And the value of Turkey for the United States is not from an instrumental point of view. Turkey is no country to be used by anyone. Turkish people are not there to be manipulated or used by anyone. And the trouble here is, how do we tell those stories and those narratives? And I think it's really hard on a strategic bilateral relationship for governments or militaries to do that. We need the private sector to step up. And so it's easy as businesses sometimes to kind of see danger and walk away from it. There's some businesses that see danger and walk right to it because of the business model they're in. The trouble is, what are those interests and how do we align them in a more significant way? It's heartbreaking to me as someone who teaches Turkish politics and Turkish studies here in the United States, how little interest in the positive sense there is, how few Americans are going to Turkey now, how few Turkish students are coming to America. I mean, I did a Fulbright fellowship to Turkey where I fell in love with Turkey, and I can tell you the countless number of lives that have been changed, not just Americans, but Turks coming to the U.S., and when those exchange programs get shut down, as they were because of security concerns, I understand the need to protect life, but at the same time, I think I sometimes feel less safe in this town in D.C. walking through than I do in Istanbul. And of course, anybody can be taken, a la Corson, I should say, from any moment in time. But the challenge is, how do we work together as civilized societies to not portray the worst in each other and to try to see the best in each other? It's like a marriage, and I dare say this, if my wife's listening, to say, as a marriage, I could focus on all the negative aspects of things. But if I do that, what's going to happen to that relationship. Whereas if I focus on the positive and say, I want to bring out the best in you, and I want to make sure this relationship is as strong as it is, and we work on the problems, then we go in a much more positive direction as equals and not as subordinate or trying to needing each other in a negative sense.
I'd say one other thing, which is we need to try and do a better job of seeing each other through the other's eyes. And this really hit home when I went to Turkey at the end of September, and I was taken to the Turkish parliament, and I stood there and I looked at the damage from the bombing during the coup attempt, and heard stories from all the different parties about what it was like to be an employee in that building and have it bombed. And I brought home a real sense of the trauma that the Turkish people had gone through in the middle of July last summer. But I don't think most Americans appreciate that. And that's something that has not been conveyed by the media, I think, adequately. But having that kind of an appreciation would, I think, fundamentally change the way that Americans look at Turkey and what's going on in Turkey now. And likewise, I don't think many Turks understand how the world looks from America right now. So I think we can do a better job in people-to-people terms, business-to-business terms, and government-to-government terms to make an effort to see the other through their eyes.
I think forget about Turks not understanding what the world looks like through America's eyes. I think right now Americans in different parts of the country don't understand what the vision is and what it looks like from their neighbor's point of view. So it's something that's very hard to, I think, coalesce around. So it's a great point. To move away from the public optics for a moment and just give you a second to very briefly reflect upon the recent head of state visit. It appeared on according to most public accounts, President Erdogan's visit at the executive level went fairly well. The two leaders seemed to have in the Oval Office a sincere and genuine meeting. What do you think are the primary takeaways here, not looking back, but looking forward for the next 4 years? How do you think this first official engagement in Washington portends for the future of the bilateral relationship, or next 4 to 8 years?
Well, I think first of all, we've established a commitment by both leaders to work to deepen and broaden the relationship, to intensify and reinvigorate our trade and commercial ties, to ensure we're standing shoulder to shoulder in the fight against terror and terror groups like ISIS and the PKK. As the president said, we need to ensure that they have no safe quarter. I think the two leaders now have a personal rapport that gives us something to build on. That said, at a lower working level, we have been having frequent conversations, but they've mostly been narrowly focused, and we need to broaden their focus. We need to be talking about how to try and make the Aegean a more peaceful region and a region for prosperity. We need to be talking about how to bring about a solution in Cyprus so that it becomes a bizonal, bicommunal federation that under durable conditions. We need to keep talking about the future of Syria. We need to talk about the role that Iran plays in the Middle East, because I think we have a very common appreciation and a strategic alignment in terms of how we want to and need to deal with Iranian influence in the Middle East. I could go down a checklist of issues, but those are conversations that we've been having in a much at a lower level and in a more truncated manner, and we need to have a more in-depth, consistent conversation about those issues. And that's what I foresee happening over the next 4 years. And that will help to broaden the base of the strategic alliance.
Yeah, I mean, to start with the positive, because that's what I like to focus on, it is clear to me that there is room for a relationship to grow between these two personal leaders. And given that these two leaders are very similar in different ways, both populist, both nationalists in different ways, and there are some other significant differences, but the fact that these two leaders are getting along, I think, is a good thing in the short term, but it's not something we can rely on directly. In other words, if we're hoping that the U.S.-Turkey relationship will be sorted out by Donald Trump and Tayyip Erdogan, I hate to tell everyone that's not enough. Even if they got along well, just like Mr. Erdogan has gotten along with Putin and others, clearly events change over time, and the U.S.-Turkey relationship is too important for just two individuals. But as the presidents of two countries that are the heads of state, how can that trickle down? Now, on the negative side of things, starting first with Washington, because I think we need to put a mirror up to ourselves, we're missing a large number of our senior officials. As you'll see throughout the conference, it's not that they weren't invited. Who do you invite? It's important at the working level that you have people that are appreciative of both sides of the relationship. And sometimes what frustrates me is that I feel like On the Turkish side, they're overstaffed, but the people don't seem to have the same level of appreciation for whatever reason. And then on the American side, the people just aren't there, or they're not empowered because of the political process in Washington. And as you already pointed out, Gillian, the last 4 months have felt like 4 years in Washington. Things that I never would have predicted 6 months ago have seemingly come to pass in a way that's very hard to keep track of. And unfortunately, on the day that this visit happened, you had the kind of the National Security Council advisor having to go out in front of the press and to defend what happened the week before, which is very unfair to Turkey in many different ways. And the irony, of course, of President Erdogan having to go in and hearing throughout the questions as he's sitting there, no questions about Turkey and all questions about, what did you say to the Russian foreign minister? I mean, there's nothing that's more offensive in some ways as a great power than to have to listen to something else. And so I thought in some ways he was very gracious in that sense. And so things didn't go as badly as many American analysts thought. They thought there'd be a real showdown, a mano-a-mano between Erdogan and Trump because of some of the policy differences they had. And on the other hand, they didn't go as well as many Turkish analysts had hoped for, where there'd be a complete reset of relations and they'd be able to have it. And then this is not even talking about the official side of things. What happened outside the ambassador's residence, where regardless of which side you're on, it doesn't matter who was right or wrong, the damage is done. And it continues to be done. And that's, I think particularly as those of us in this community that work with our governments, helping to tamp down the emotions. If we let this relationship go into the areas of emotion, where it goes back to the old days of kind of Turkish nationalism on one side and American kind of superiority of our democracy and human rights and freedom of press, nobody wins. When the first question I get asked by every single person that I've ever known is, what's wrong with the country you study with? Something's going wrong, right? Everybody in America has seen these images because it plays into the kind of bias that's already out there. So there's not much we can do right now on that particular incident. I don't think anybody should be going out there and trying to defend or try to fight that, but to focus on the broader issues that were raised. We need to work with our Turkish friends if we're going to defeat Daesh and ISIS. And I keep on telling everyone who will listen, the last legitimate caliphate in the Muslim world was out of Istanbul, not Raqqa, not out of Mosul. And if we're going to defeat that extreme ideology, it doesn't start in Saudi Arabia, it starts in Turkey. And it may be difficult, but the second largest military force in NATO sits right there with the longest border. And if we're going to have any success, we can't sell our short-term kind of expediency of working with one particular group to be able to think about what the longer term looks like with Turkey. And I think there are going to be policy disagreements, but we have to have those in a civil discourse. We're missing that discourse right now. And I think that this week in some ways catalyzed all the things that are very worst in the relationship. And while there were some good statements that came out, it does make me concerned, because I had hoped that this relationship would give everyone else the cover they needed to start being more realistic in their conversations between U.S. and Turkey. And instead, I'm stuck here having to talk about what bodyguard did what and what protester did what.
I think that's a fair point. To pull on a thread here that you both mentioned, that's our shared interest in counterterrorism policy and combating ISIS. There are two distinct narratives emerging that I see in Washington, among policymakers in Washington, about terrorism. One tells us that terrorist attacks in the West and nations sympathetic to Western ideals are really the new normal, for lack of a better word. That what we really need to do is to get better at living with terrorist attacks or the threat of terrorist attacks, and to focus on mitigating the effects and consequences. The opposing narrative insists that if we accept this reality, we're all doomed. And so the focus needs to be up on shoring national defense, preventing terrorists from gaining access via stricter immigration and refugee policies. Are these two approaches for the United States and for Turkey mutually exclusive, or is there a middle ground that we might pursue in the future with a greater degree of success? How do you see the way that the United States and Turkey's differing or similar approaches are working and not working? Josh, would you like to go first?
Sure, I'll take it. One of the challenges that we have is that when you talk about terrorism, the security element overwhelms everything. And those who are sitting here in uniform and those who've served before, I think would be the first to point out that if you're having to have that conversation now, that's a reactive security measure, you've lost the battle. We need to be proactive in kind of figuring out. It's the intelligence gathering. It's the, and that's why what happened a couple weeks ago with Donald Trump and whatever happened in that meeting is concerning deeply, and it's something that's going to have repercussions. We have a special counsel now. I mean, this is a really big deal. History shows us that when you set up these type of things, things begin to move down. And so the broader conversation about how do you combat terrorism and how do you work with a country like Turkey, it's not just the military cooperation and trying to figure out who are the bad guys and who are we targeting. In some ways, that's the easy side. That's the tactical side. But the political side, and I think actually to be very blunt and to be very honest, because I think we should say this among friends, I'm not convinced that the U.S. has a strategy on this. We may have a strategy on defeating ISIS in a military sense and being able to take Raqqa back. But longer term, if you don't have a sustained campaign, and I'm not talking about just military here, I'm talking about development assistance, I'm talking about diplomatic, I'm talking about private sector investment, so that the root causes of this terrorism and the disenfranchisement we see of the Sunni populations in both Iraq and Syria are addressed, then I don't see how we can have that conversation. It's a short-term thing, because when you defeat Al-Qaeda, the next thing that's going to come up is ISIS. And guess what? Al-Qaeda is now coming back, and the Nusra. I mean, the names change, but the ideologies are the same. And I think the trouble that we have in Washington is that whatever the next terrorist attack is kind of as far out as we can see. And that's why it's important to have the different bureaus and different agencies involved at the working level to say, okay, there was this horrible attacks. And unfortunately, Turkey knows better than any other country in the world what this looks like. The Syrian civil war is now right inside of your country. You've got more refugees than any other country. You've got more of these horrible attacks that have happened. The tourism industry has been destroyed because of these terrorist attacks. And yet at the same time, when I look at the contrast between Turkish Airlines that delivers babies on airplanes and United Airlines that drags passengers off airplanes, there's nothing better in terms of hospitality and kind of Turkish tourism. Which way do you want to go on this? And so how do you reconcile these two things? And I'm not trying to be flippant or to be kind of avoiding the question, but I am simply saying that the tactical military strategies that we have that are going to be discussed at the NATO summit, that are going to be discussed at the G7 summit, that are being discussed right now on a day-to-day basis that Jonathan and the ambassadors on both sides have to deal with are critically important. But they can't do their job operating in a vacuum without the rest of us saying, well, we've got to find a way to have this conversation. We're getting ready for the month of the holy month of Ramadan, and many people that I talk to, including my own family that are very conservative, Fox News watching Christians, think that there's something wrong with the religion of Islam. And so when I go to them and tell them, guess what? My favorite time in Turkey was Ramadan. And they say, you're crazy. You say, well, actually, fasting during the day is a great thing, because you know how much you eat at night? I gained like 10 kilos when I was in Turkey during Ramadan. And there's not an appreciation, but any American that ever gets to visit an iftar or a Turkish hospitality will never be the same, because they understand in a true sense what this is about and understand just how abhorrent people that use this religion in the name of. In the same way that I get very upset when any other religious group uses kind of an ideology to kill somebody else.
I think I would just add that the tools of combating terrorism are they're diverse and multifaceted, as Joshua said. They also depend on coordination across national boundaries, because having a great domestic counterterrorism portfolio doesn't protect your allies, and it doesn't do enough to protect you yourself. So to the extent that we can continue cooperating and finding common approaches between the U.S. and Turkey, and more broadly among NATO, among other countries that are committed to fighting terrorism, we do ourselves a collective service.
A quick question for each of you on Europe, and then I'm going to open this up for a few minutes of questions from the audience. Jonathan, Britain's decision to leave the EU was made via referendum last year, and the official process set in motion a few weeks ago. We all know this decision will surely reshape Britain's place on the world stage in some predictable and some unpredictable, unanticipatable ways. But what effect do you think Brexit's likely to have on Turkey and its role inside Europe and vis-a-vis the European Union?
Wow, that's I think a better question for I wish we had a Turkish colleague on the panel. I think it's early to tell. And hard to speculate. Partly it depends how the Brexit path ends up being paved, let's say. But certainly with the UK outside of the EU, there will be additional challenges and opportunities, and it's just hard to guess what those might be. But it's something that Turkey and we will be watching and seeing what can be done. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Josh.
I mean, I think if I read the Turkish media correctly, and the feeling of kind of saying, okay, well, there seemed to be one way towards Western civilization in terms of European Union membership, and that was the real path. And, I mean, in some ways, Turks have been on a Western journey since, like, Genghis Khan and Tamerlane and Ataturk, and kind of EU was that natural final step. You can't take away the EU's economic draw for Turkey. When I look at all the businesses in this room, the majority of your business and where you're making the majority of your money and your investment, et cetera, is coming from Europe. However, when you juxtapose that with the political kind of straitjacket that people feel and some of the rhetoric coming out of Europe, because it's hard to talk about Europe in a singular sense right now, right? When you have certain leaders that are making comments in the way they are. Britain offers seemingly an alternative path, but Britain and Turkey, for a lot of similarities, are not the same. And I would be very careful drawing and extrapolating any kind of similarities, because Britain has always been a singular case. And Britain's place in the world, from its great empire to its special relationship with the United States, can't be replicated by any other country. And so, I think the danger I see with kind of the press and the writing about, well, maybe Brexit's a good example, and maybe Turkey will have its own referendum, as the president has said, to get out of its EU process. While I understand the instinctive nature and the emotionality that I talked about, to me it's very dangerous. And we have to also see, look, we've had a whole bunch of leaders elected newly. We had the wave of populism that brought Donald Trump to the White House, and now we've had some ways a counteraction in Europe to this. The Dutch elections, the French elections, we'll see what happens in the German elections. But I think it's too early to tell right now. Are we looking at a seismic change in the international system and the international order that began with this? Or in some ways these were reactive to areas and they were kind of self-corrections along the way. So being able to take that for what it is, and particularly those of you in the business community who look at the business markets to see the reactions that the different markets have taken to this are particularly important to look at. But I agree, it's too early to tell. It's also it's very challenging from a Turkish point of view to draw particular lessons because Britain is so unique.
I'll offer you, Jonathan, do you have any just final thoughts, things that we didn't get to touch on that you wanted to make sure that, I want to make sure you have the opportunity to mention anything that you want to during this discussion.
The key thing is, I want our Turkish friends to know, we take Turkey's concerns seriously on every issue that gets raised with us, including on the YPG. And the decisions that we made were made based on a variety of factors. But we absolutely remain committed to Turkey's security and to our alliance with Turkey. So I think it's important to recognize that. And allies don't always agree. On this one we disagreed, but we need to find a way to work forward anyway.
Thank you very much, Josh.
So as an optimist, I really do believe Turkey is one of the top 5 countries for the United States. And when you looked at the last administration, there was a lot of reporting that Turkey was one of the top 5 countries that our president talked with. I don't think that maybe we're at that place right now, but we're not far enough off. And we could very easily get back to there. And part of this is on each of us in terms of the level of our business relationship has never reached the same level as our military cooperation. And even as we disagree about what's happening in Syria or Iraq or other areas, we need to be cognizant of the fact that so much of this can change rapidly. It's very easy to get into a mindset and say, well, there's not much we can do about this. And actually, as we've seen this week as well, things can happen that have unintended consequences, and in the negative sense, but there's also the positive sense. And so every investment that people are making, as Jonathan already pointed out, the tone of town that's going on in this town is about job creation. It's about economically empowering kind of a middle class that seems to have been ignored in different parts of the country. These trade delegations that don't just come and talk to the different bubbles that are in Washington and in Ankara are particularly important. So getting the people from Kayseri to Kansas, getting people from Diyarbakir out to Denver, getting these types of connections are particularly important. And whether it's through sister city relationships, university relationships, business delegations, I think we have to redouble our efforts, and particularly with our elected leaders, not just in the executive branches, but in our parliaments and our congresses. We need to be cognizant of that, because I think that Turkey right now is so focused on the DC bubble that it needs to focus beyond that sometimes. Well, America is so much bigger than that. If it had been up to Washington, we never would be sitting in the president's hotel right now.
This is true. Do we have the mic capabilities set up to do audience questions? Because we've got about 5 minutes, so happy to take 1 or 2 questions. Yeah, sorry, it's hard to see, the bright lights. Okay, can we take a question from back there? Does anyone have a question that they would like to, for either of the panelists? Sir?
Good morning. There's that misperception maybe in Turkey that there is the big Middle East project, redrawing the lines, the borders, and so on and so forth. Is that a misconception? Is that real? If that is real, then when U.S. sides with the YPG, people say, aha, there it is. There is a template. This is what's going on. So what's the truth?
The United States supports the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the countries of the region as they currently exist. That's the truth.
If I can just add one area to that. I think it's very easy to look at this. I look at things from a historical perspective. And the last time the region went through this type of flux was at the end of the Ottoman Empire. And so the feeling, which is totally natural from a Turkish experience, is the last time this happened, we had to deal with a very difficult situation. And it seems clear to me that we don't know what the end state of Syria looks like yet, right? That chapter has to be written. And so I understand why Turkey feels the way it does, and I empathize with what's going on. But if the official government line, and I believe this line to be true, and I have no reason to doubt any of my friends in government service, the challenge is we all have to work towards that goal. And unfortunately, when I look at the wars that are being fought both in Syria and in Iraq, there are civil wars. In some ways, this is not about kind of capabilities. It seems clear to me that the U.S. with its allies have the overwhelming force here. The trouble is, does anybody want to get back into a quagmire situation? And when I look at the way in which the Turks and the U.S. have disagreed on this, if we both were on the same page, we wouldn't be having this conversation. We clearly have a difference of opinion. And I think the question is going to be, with the U.S. taking the approach it's currently taking, then the Turks taking the approach they're taking, where can we find that delta of compromise? But I think that the larger point you're raising is something that's not for the great powers to determine, like after World War I, where we could just rewrite those areas. They're being rewritten by the people of the region themselves. And as we saw with the Arab Spring that has now turned into something else that we're all trying to figure out what to call it, we're not sure yet. So in some ways, it might be too early to tell. But if the U.S. government is committed to the territorial integrity, then that leads to a series of things that we should be doing together to make sure that that's truth. And to me, Turkey is one of the most stable and strongest in the region. So if I'm Turkey, I'm less concerned about my geographic borders. I'm more concerned about my neighbors that could create problems in the future.
Thank you both for that. Any other questions from the audience for either of the panelists? It's hard for me to see. No.
We did such a good job. We've answered all the
no more
questions. There are none these days.
We've gone around the world. We've touched on Europe and the Middle East and North America. So
Can I make one last point on this? And I'd be interested in Jonathan's perspective on this. Something that I don't hear being talked about very much in the U.S. is when I looked at Tayyip Erdogan's schedule in the last month, it's very telling that he visited India, Russia, China, and then the United States. And so I don't have a sense of insecurity about Turkey being lost to the east and focusing on Asia. But in Washington, at least, there seems to be different camps here, where basically people focus on Turkey's kind of orientation in the Middle East or Europe or to Asia. And I'm fascinated because one of the challenges that we've always had with Turkey is it's hard to put Turkey in a particular bucket. And Jonathan works on this from the perspective from kind of Southeast Europe and thinking about it from the Aegean and kind of Europe from that perspective. But other branches of government think about it differently. And as a business environment, it's been very interesting to watch the way in which Turkey fits in different buckets. It's kind of like you include Turkey in the European area, you include Turkey in the Middle Eastern, and increasingly I find Turkey included in the Asian area. So I'm curious in terms of how the U.S. government deals with Turkey because of the fact it's such a multi-regional actor, and how you go to these broader areas. You mentioned about the Black Sea and about the Mediterranean, and you mentioned the Middle East as well. How do you deal with that on a day-to-day basis? Because to me, when I look at it from a business environment, we deal with this all the time, and so is the government being responsive to that as well?
We're trying to be, and I think we need to be increasingly responsive to it. For example, when we have Turkish delegations that come here, or when we send American delegations, governmental delegations to go to Turkey, we generally talk about Middle Eastern issues, Aegean issues, Balkan issues, Russia. So we bring in the people from the parts of the government that specialize in those areas on both sides to compare notes. And as I said at the top, we tend to have much more in common than we have that divides us. The other thing I would say is it's not surprising that Turkey is developing connections with new parts of the world, more parts of the world, as a growing economy, really an inspirational economy that went from a poor to a middle class status over the course of a decade. That buys it entree into markets and relationships that it didn't have before. So not surprised to see that. When I was working in Turkey in the early 2000s, the conversation in the international community was, would Turkey go east or go west? And I think the answer is it goes both. It has to because of where it sits, and it has to because of its national interests. And that makes it actually a more valuable ally and partner for the United States. That said, I think it's critical that we continue to work to ensure that Turkey's westward orientation remains strong and central.
I'll tie that back to something you said at the opening, Jonathan, which is that the United States and Turkey share common interests on every side in the region. And so that's something I think that everybody here today can go forward thinking about. And as Dr. Walker said, perception eventually becomes reality on both sides. And so it's the message that we leave the conference with and go back to our respective corners, whether it be government here in the United States, business, whether it be Turkey's government and business sector overseas. That's the common core interests that we share, I think, are the things to message forward and to really focus on in order to bring the bilateral relationship forward. Thank you so much to both of these panelists. We can offer them a round of applause. Thank you.